All right, friends, welcome to our live Q&A. Not long ago, JP Moreland and I talked about his best case for the soul in his new book, The Substance of Consciousness. And you have posted a lot of questions on Twitter, on the original YouTube video. Some of you have emailed me these questions. So JP, I've got about a dozen questions, ranging in their complexity all over the map on the evidence for the soul. I know you got your Kansas City Chief hat on, so I'm guessing you're ready to rock and roll.
I'm ready to rock and roll. Great to be with you and with your audience.
Well, we got a lot of comments. People love each time you come on. And let's just jump into one that I know is near and dear to you because you've also written on this topic. But somebody said, how does substance dualism relate to issues like depression and mental illness?
Well, there are several varieties of substance dualism, but all of them imply that the soul functions in dependence on the body, and there are things about the body that depend upon the soul for them to function. So there are two-way causal or dependency relations between soul and body. Now, I happen to think that the soul, while we're embodied, needs for its organs to be functioning before the soul can perceive or hear or things like that. Now, if the brain is damaged, then it could impact the soul's ability for a person to gain memory or to have other kinds of mental activity. And here's an illustration. It's not perfect, but it will at least help, I think. Imagine that I'm a driver in a car, but they've strapped me in the driver's seat with a seatbelt that won't unlock, and they've closed the doors and locked them. So I'm stuck in the front seat. Now, my ability to get around town will depend upon whether the car functions. For example, if I'm driving and the steering wheel brakes so that it'll only turn left, well, then that will keep me from turning right, even though I myself have the ability to do that. I can't because the car won't let me, and so on. Now, if I could get out of the car, I wouldn't be limited. And I'm using the car. I think the relationship between the soul and body is more intimate than a driver and a car. But that illustrates that just because the car breaks down and I can't do something, it doesn't mean I'm the car. So that's the way I see the two related. Maybe that will illustrate.
That's helpful. So the driver is the soul and the body is
Yes.
the car. Of course, you can get out of the car, but in reality, there's a deeper, more intimate connection. And of course,
Yes.
the driver is immaterial and the,
Right.
body, etc. So there's that distinction. But that's a
Right.
helpful dynamic in the relationship between mental illness and how it can affect us as we are embodied.
That's right.
So that's great. Folks, we've got a few questions. I'm going to honor those who posted them before, but I already see some other great questions coming through here. We'll make sure we get to some live ones as well. All right, here's a challenge that came up, JP. They said physicalists might argue that Occam's razor rules out the soul. How so? Just as hydrogen and oxygen give rise to the property of wetness, the physical brain gives rise to the soul.
Well, I don't mean to be mean-spirited. I'm here to help. I really am. But one way I can help is to maybe point out that a question is confused, just to help the person kind of rethink their question. And this question is really confused because just because hydrogen and oxygen can give rise to water and it has wetness, uh, that doesn't mean there isn't such a thing as wetness. Uh, uh,
Hmm.
and so the latter part of the question, would you read the last sentence of the question again?
It said, just as hydrogen and oxygen give rise to the property of wetness, the physical brain gives rise to the soul.
Well, if the physical brain gives rise to the soul, that's William Hasker's view, well, then the soul is real.
Hmm.
and that establishes substance dualism.
Hmm.
My argument here it is not that God is needed for the soul to come to be. I have views on that, but my issue is there a soul
Hmm.
that is non-physical, that is very deeply connected to the body, and could survive the death of the body? That's my issue. I'm not concerned as to how the soul comes to be.
Hmm.
By the way, there was another confusion in the question, and that is the difference between an emergent property and an emergent substance. And there are a lot of people who believe in emergent properties, but very, very few, if any, but just a couple of people I know of believe that an entire substance could emerge
Hmm.
from say the brain. So we want to keep clear properties and substances. They're not the same, and one it's more easy to conceive it as emerging, although I don't believe in any emergent properties. Uh, so
Okay, so
keep
is it
that in
fair to
mind.
think about it this way? When it comes to intelligent design, part of the question is, are there signs of intelligence within nature?
Yeah.
And then the follow-up question would be, who or what is the source of that information? Same
Yes,
with the soul. If this argues that the soul is an emergent property, then we have the existence of the soul, concedes substance dualism. That's distinct from where the soul itself comes from. That's the follow up question that we
that's
would
right.
then look
That
at. Okay, and you lay out well at the beginning of your book, if there is such thing as a soul, what does this tell us about the world, worldview, naturalism, etc.? That's the follow up question. Okay,
exactly.
excellent. Okay, here was a comment somebody said, just really straightforward. They said, "Why did consciousness arise? Really? Evolutionary advantage." Next.
Well, I had a little trouble understanding the question, but consciousness does not give any advantage to an organism in the struggle for evolutionary survival, none whatsoever.
Hmm.
And because in evolution, we the organism is a black box, and what that means is that evolution doesn't quote unquote see what's going on inside the organism. The only relevance as to what's going on inside the organism is an output or a behavior that it causes, and then that is visible. So, what evolution
Hmm.
selects for are outputs given certain inputs that aid us in feeding and reproducing and fleeing enemies and fighting. But it's the output that is selected for, not what's inside the organism.
Hmm.
Now, it may be what causes the output, but that's an accidental feature. So you could easily conceive of just a complex computer that has no consciousness at all,
Hmm.
but was able to efficiently, given scanning certain things, the waves coming in would cause it to move in a certain direction so that it would avoid being eaten or destroyed. And you could even make a case that consciousness would be unproductive because it might delay your response to a
Hmm.
predator. It wouldn't be instantaneous. And so uh, now somebody might say, well, the consciousness may give you an awareness of the truth or what's really going on out there, and that would help you get away. But the fact is that, as Plantinga has shown, that if you are consistently wrong, you'll do just as well to survive as if you have truth. For example, if I see a large predator as though it's a small little thing, and I have a desire to get rid of small little things, I want to get away from small little things, then I am misperceiving what's out there,
Hmm.
but my misperception is going to get me to the cave where I survive. So consistent error is just as effective as truth.
Hmm.
So you don't need truth to survive. It's
Hmm.
utterly irrelevant.
Hmm. All right, friends, we're talking with philosopher J.P. Moreland, one of the top 50 living influential philosophers. His book, The Substance of Consciousness, taking your tough objections to substance dualism, or the reality of the soul. Now, this one, J.P. said, why did consciousness arise? Because of evolutionary advantage. And your point is it doesn't actually offer any evolutionary advantage. What if we just said, for the sake of argument, I concede that consciousness, once it arises, provides evolutionary advantage. But that still doesn't explain how the soul came to be through an evolutionary process. So it seems like you're damned if you do, damned if you don't. Do you agree with that?
Oh, that's such an important point because so often people get these confused. Let's suppose that, like you said, that the appearance of consciousness, once it comes to be, confers evolutionary advantage on an organism. That still doesn't explain why consciousness came to be. That only explains that given that it came to be, then such and such. But the question of how did it come to be is not touched at all by that different issue. And I personally do not believe that if you say in the beginning were the particles, or the strings, or the quantum waves, or the turtles, whatever you got in the beginning, if it's physical, if you have that, and the history of the world is the rearrangement of those physical entities to form more complex physical entities, you're not going to get consciousness because that's getting something from nothing. The only way to avoid that is to go with panpsychism, where every individual little thing has its own level of consciousness, all the way down to electrons. They're conscious in their own way. I think that if you say in the beginning was the Logos, then your fundamental entity is conscious, God, and you don't have a problem with the origin of consciousness because that characterizes your primitive fundamental being. Now you could still ask, well, why did God create conscious beings and so on, but that's a different question as to how consciousness came about. And it would be easily solved if there were a God who, in certain situations, created it and brought it to be.
I see some comments here, some supporters, some critics, and we're going to go to your questions in a little bit. If you would put the word question in caps and then state your question as succinct as possible, we'll try to get JP as many of those as we can. Let's move to number 4. One person wrote on YouTube, they said, it seems that the sense of dualism which children naturally intuit could be explained by the sensation of existing as software running on the hardware of a brain. Likewise, consciousness being a property of software seems to account for the conceptual possibility of your soul being able to exist apart from the body. Your thoughts?
Yeah, no expert in the field of cognitive or other forms of psychology take that explanation. They all acknowledge that it is having a soul that is geographically ubiquitous among little children without indoctrination. Now, the problem with the question is that they've not told me what software is. I have no idea what you mean by it. And it turns out on inspection that software is literally a set of concepts and ideas in the mind of the designer of that object, of that. And what's there in the machine and the computer is simply digitized programs or grooves or things that will run the machine through a series of states where there's positive charge or negative, and it moves, but there's no information literally or consciousness or anything like that. So when there's a great difference between a machine being able to run some physical object that is expressing software in the mind of the designer of that versus consciousness. Consciousness is not characterized by what it does. Software is. You have a program that adds, and you have a word processor. What does it do? Well, it creates documents. So software is defined by what it does. Consciousness is defined by what it is.
Hmm.
There is a what it is like to having a conscious state, say, of pain. And so there's a disanalogy between the two. And you have to keep in mind that that the claim is being made not simply that people naturally as little children believe they're conscious, but they believe they have a self or a soul or
Hmm.
an ego that could survive in an afterlife. So that's even different than questions about
Hmm.
software or uh, you know, even if I granted the point, I could still ask, well, but why did they go beyond thinking they had software or being fooled by software and thinking that they were a self? That is not explained.
Hmm.
So those would be some responses.
Good. I'm going to pause and take a live question because I think this comes from someone not convinced by your case and states his objection well. So this comes from Travis Statham. I'll read it. He says, can you define what a soul is composed of? If it's spiritual only, how can scientists distinguish that from imagination?
Well, first of all, imagination is itself spiritual. I mean, if somebody is
Hmm.
engaged in an imagination, that's a mental state, a conscious state. It's not physical.
Hmm.
Why? Because a state of imagination is about something. It has intentionality. There is a what it's like to imagining ice cream that's different than there's a what it's like to imagining hitting a home run in a baseball game. And there is no such thing as a what it's like to being a brain state or a neuron or a set of neurons that fire. You will look in vain in any neuroscience text when they're describing the physicality of the brain that they will make a reference to intentionality and what it's like because matter doesn't have that. But the other thing I would say would be the question I think is confused because if you're using composed as you might say a desk is composed of wood, then you're
Mm-hmm.
thinking of the soul as a kind of stuff.
Mm.
And dualists don't think of the soul as a stuff. They think of the soul as having the intrinsic constituents
Mm-hmm.
that are the properties of consciousness and life. So the essence of the soul is it contains the actual or potential properties of having sensations, of having emotions, of having thoughts, of having beliefs, of having desires, of exercising free volitional power, and of enlivening and animating a body for some substance dualists, the more
Mm.
Aristotelian sort. So the it's a mistake to say what is the soul composed of because it's not the sort of thing
Mm.
that is composed of stuff. Now, how could somebody identify that there were a soul?
Mm.
Well, in the same way that you could identify that a person is conscious and alive. If I am stuck with a pin and I feel pain and I grimace and shout, ouch, and I see another person who's stuck with a pin and they're grimacing and shouting, ouch, I can't be aware of the pain in between, but it seems very reasonable to
Mm.
infer that they're an awful lot like me and they probably have pain between being stuck with a pin and shouting, ouch, and grimacing. So there is a very close inference to the best explanation there. Similarly, there are certain things the soul enables us to do: exercise libertarian freedom, have a unified consciousness, where the brain cannot do that because consciousness would be distributed among different regions and parts. This is called the binding problem. And so
Mm-hmm.
you could infer from certain things we know, say about intentional behavior, that that person must have had a conscious state where they hated that person and intended to punch them in the face because they were mad at them.
Mm.
And and that's a reasonable thing, even though I can't see it. Whereas robots and zombies don't have any intentions or any conscious states whatsoever.
Mm.
And so that would be one way of doing it.
Here's a question that somebody wrote earlier, and I've seen a couple times in the chat right now. Do animals have souls? And if so, what might this mean for their ability to feel pain and or for their eternal state? And somebody said, what about like algae and insects? How far would you take
Yeah,
this?
yeah. Well, see, the reason the people that think that this is an odd question is because they haven't been acquainted with the way people thought for centuries.
Hmm.
They're only aware of how people have thought since, the 1920s or 30s. Um, and the point I'm making is that a soul is that which contains consciousness and enlivens it's the organism's body. And so, if we have evidence that there is a whole that is not just a collection of parts, that it's not just an aggregate or a heap of parts, but that whole is functioning as a unity, and the different features of its soul, like you take a cell and the different components of the cell are functioning in light of the needs of the whole, and like a paramecium or something of that sort, then
Mm-hmm.
we have evidence that there is a soul there, because the soul is what gives life. Now, a vegetable soul does not is not conscious, but it is a principle of life
Hmm.
that makes a tomato plant not just a collection of physical parts, but a whole that grows teleologically towards the end of being a mature, let's say, tomato plant. So I think the basic confusion here is to say that um, souls are just rational uh, powers, and are you trying to say that a earthworm has rational powers? No, there are different kinds of souls, and there are actually
Hmm.
ways of telling the difference. I'm not going to go into that.
Sure.
What I'm saying is that I think a worm is a living being. I don't think it's
Mm-hmm.
an automaton. I don't think it's just a heap of parts like a mechanical worm. I think it's a whole that is ontologically prior to all of its parts, and it is has life, and it may even have consciousness. I'm not, the farther down we go, the less sure I am about consciousness. But
Sure.
but that's what I would say.
Okay. Fair enough. That's super
I don't
helpful.
find that the least bit odd. And
Now,
I would
some
like to
people
I'd like
go
to
ahead.
return the question: what do you think the difference is between something being living and non-living? And you can't appeal
Mm-hmm.
to biological processes, because those aren't life. They're just biological factors that help life remain. They sustain life, but they're not identical to life. So, I'd like an answer to that.
Good. Good stuff. Let's shift to this one. I think is really interesting. This has come up a couple times in the chat room. Again, if you write question with caps and go right to the point, we will try to get to your questions. I see a ton here, as much as we can. But for now, let's go back to the questions people posted before. Somebody said, how would you respond to the claim that substance dualism enables trans activists to justify their position that someone can be born in the wrong body?
Well, it depends upon the kind of substance dualism you hold. There are several versions of substance dualism, including a kind that I hold, which is more Aristotelian or Thomistic. It's not quite identical to that. But on those kinds of substance dualist views, the soul is a substance, but the body is not a substance. The body is more kind of a mode, that it depends upon the soul. If the soul leaves, it's not a body any longer, it's literally a
Mm,
corpse. But in this case, then, the nature of the body is an outward manifestation of the instructions or the essence of the soul, as Aristotle would put it. Today we call it information, but they're almost identical. If you look at an Aristotelian essence, it looks almost like what biologists are calling information. And so the body is an expression of the kind of soul it is. And so if you have a
mm,
male body, that's evidence of having a male soul. So the Thomistic type has a very natural
mm.
way of explaining this. The Cartesian dualist, which believes that the soul is a substance and it relates to its body by merely cause and effect. So that what makes my body mine is that when I will to raise my hand, this hand goes up. And when my leg gets stuck with a pin, I feel pain. And that's why this is my body. I think the Cartesian still has an answer to the question. And I think the Cartesian would want to say that either through evolution or through divine origin of the soul, that a soul would be suited for the body that it indwells. And what I mean by that is the soul would have a range of powers and capacities that corresponded to the things that the body can and cannot do. It would be a waste, for example, if souls had powers, but they were stuck in a body that didn't have the ability to to perform those powers. So suppose that my soul was in a round organism, and my soul had the power to raise my legs, but I don't have legs. Well, that would be why would evolution select for that? Because it's utterly unhelpful evolutionarily. And why would God create souls that have powers that go beyond the bodies He placed those souls in? So therefore, it means that the soul's nature and abilities are naturally suited, however that came about, for a particular kind of body and not other kinds of bodies. And so a male soul would be more suited to be able to perform functions with a female body. Did I say male soul? A male soul
Yeah.
would be more able to function with the latent potentialities of a male body than a female body.
Gotcha.
And so that would be why this doesn't really work against the two,
Okay. Good
the two
stuff. All
views.
right.
Yeah.
Here's an objection. We're going to jump to live questions. And I know you deal with this in your book. And this, to me at least, is one of the most common ones that I hear. But let's address it because I know people are thinking about it. It's basically the interaction problem between immaterial and physical, between the body and between the soul. So Cody says, do you think that science has the data that can be empirically gathered and studied in regards to the soul? Besides our body's interaction, how does the soul interact with the physical? And if so, how?
Well, there are many things to say. First of all, the question, how could the body and soul interact, has two interpretations. There's a mechanistic interpretation, and then there's a skeptical interpretation. Let me take them one at a time. If you mean the mechanistic interpretation, when you say, well, how can the soul interact with the body?
Mm-hmm.
That would be like saying, how does turning on the ignition in a car cause the pistons to start moving? And that kind of question is a request for a mechanism that stands between the turning of the ignition and the moving of the pistons, that explains how it is that A,
Okay.
through this mechanism, causes B to happen. Now, if that's the question, the answer is that it is a category fallacy, because the soul does not cause things to happen to the body or the other way by means of anything. It is direct and basic. So there is no how. Now there has to be a how, right? Because if A causes something to happen to B by doing something through C, then you could ask, well, how is it that A is able to interact with C? And you say, well, it does it by means of another intervening mechanism, D. And this becomes an infinite regress. At some point, the interaction between two things has got to be primitive and basic, and not in virtue of anything by means of which it interacts. And I think the interaction with soul and body is primitive and basic. It's immediate. It's not in virtue of any kind of mechanism. Now, if the question is the skeptical one, it's an expression of exasperation. How in the world could you believe a soul, which is one thing, could interact with a body? That's something else. This interpretation is based upon the principle before A can causally interact with B, A has to be like B.
Mm.
But there's no good reason. I have more reason to know that I do things to my body, that I raise
Mm.
my hand, and that when a pain, I get stuck in the knee, that causes me to have a feeling of pain. I have more evidence from direct everyday experience that interaction happens than I do to believe that this causal principle that A can only cause B if they're like one another. So that's the first response. And the second one is that throughout the history of science, and even today, there have been all kinds of theories that held that two very different kinds of things
Mm.
could causally interact with one another. For example, there is the idea that a particle could interact with a wave. And there are different sorts of things. Again, a particle could interact or be actualized by a quantum wave function. And I will tell you, a quantum wave function is a very different animal
Mm.
than a particular particle that obtains at a certain place. Another example would be how charge and a thing are radically different entities. How can a charge on an electron attract a proton? And how can a field be related to gravity or pull or push? So the point is that it's never really been widely accepted that A can causally interact with B only if they're like one another. There are all
Mm.
kinds of counterexamples in science. Now, uh, does the soul's causal interaction with the body produce a little bit of energy? Well, maybe and maybe not. Let me
Mm.
explain the maybe not. There's
Okay.
a thing called quantum entanglement where you can have two particles that are, say, they can only spin in the one direction or the other direction, and you shoot them in different directions. And it always turns out that if you measure one and it's spinning in the a clockwise direction, simultaneously the other particle will be
Mm.
in the counterclockwise direction. And a major, not the only, but a major way of interpreting that is that you have these two particles causally interacting with each other without any expenditure of energy because there's not enough time for energy to be. So you could have
Mm.
causality without any increase in energy.
Okay.
And I think it may well be that the soul interacts with the body without any increase in energy. Secondly, it may be that the soul, when it interacts with the body, creates ex nihilo a tiny amount of energy because it changes things in the brain,
Okay.
but it's minuscule. And it would be very much like the energy it would take a person to flip the switch on Hoover Dam and all the potential energy of that dam being released downstream when the gates rose because that guy flipped the switch. Now maybe there was a little bit of energy involved in him flipping the switch, but the effect was an energy that's millions times greater than that. And it may be that if the soul does create a little bit of energy, it's like flipping the switch on Hoover Dam. It may
Okay.
be minuscule, but it's enough to release the potential energy in the brain. And it's that energy that keeps on going, but it was triggered by a mental event that brought about a tiny amount of energy for the triggering event to occur. And it's so minuscule, it's very hard to measure. So those would be a couple of things I'd say.
And I recall you go into some depth in your book on that. So, folks who want to know
I
more
do.
about your take on the interaction problem, you have an entire chapter, a long section walking through different
Yes.
possibilities, how to
Yes.
make sense of this. So,
And
that,
Sean, by the way, I do believe animals have souls because I
mm-hmm.
think that they're living and conscious. And do they go to heaven? I'm not sure. Just having a soul,
Mm.
nothing goes to heaven just because it has a soul. That's a necessary condition. but something can survive in the afterlife because God has chosen to sustain it. Does God choose to sustain animals? I'm leaning 60-40 that he does,
Hmm.
but I don't have a knockdown drag out on that.
Fair enough. All right. Good stuff. Boy, I see a bunch of questions coming up on here. Let's go. This one has come up a few times in the comments earlier, and I love your take on this. Somebody said it seems the story of Phineas Gage seems to support physicalism. How would you explain this within a dualistic worldview? No, I'm assuming you're familiar with this story, JP, of Phineas Gage.
Why don't you share briefly for the audience?
I think it's basically the idea that somebody had a
Yeah, right,
huge spike go through
right,
his head, changed his personality radically, but then
right,
continued to live. Thus,
right.
it seems to be that personality is in the seat of the brain rather than in the soul, and that we're
Yes.
physical.
Well, this question confuses what something is with what it depends on to function. And those are very different questions. And
Hmm.
so I would suggest that all this shows is a causal interaction between the
Hmm.
soul and a functioning brain or heart or eyeballs. I mean, if my eyeballs are put out, I can't see, but my eyeballs aren't what sees. I see by means of my eyeballs, and I am a unified, simple, conscious self. But my organs need to be working, or I can't do what I'm supposed to do while I'm
Hmm.
embodied. So I say again, a person's personality. And by the way, um, uh, the higher the structure of the soul is, and its ability to be reason to have reason, the stronger that entity can resist indoctrination. And so it's easier to indoctrinate people that haven't developed a very strong belief desire set that structures their soul. So that does show that the soul does provide some degree of resistance to personality change. And there are ways, if the physical impact isn't too great, that the soul is able to find other ways
Hmm.
of restoring the personality. We know that happens. But there are some cases where the
Hmm.
damage is so great that the soul is needing this organ to be at least semi-functional for it to do certain things, and it can't sustain its personality, and it flips. So that's it's a cause relate effect thing and dependency. It's not anything else.
And that's what we would expect within a dualistic worldview.
We would predict that.
Okay.
Absolutely.
Makes sense. Now there was a comment that said, about you and or I avoiding the toughest questions here, and then I see a lot of questions that have nothing to do with the topic at hand. If you write question in caps, we will not avoid any of the toughest questions on the soul if they relate and they're stated in a way that's understandable. We will throw them out there for JP. We're not holding them back. In fact, in your book, you take on, as far as I can tell, the toughest objections in
Well,
depth and write responses to them.
we
So,
do. In the substance of consciousness, we take on. We've read let me tell you, we've read the literature on this for years. We take on all of the big time major objections, and we address them as best we know how. But we think well
mm.
throughout the book. And so we're not afraid to take on the tough questions. We've taken on the toughest questions in this book.
And fair enough, when you say we, this is not you and me, JP, as fun as that would be to co write a book with you. Your co author is Brandon Rickabaugh. The two of you did this together. Want
Yes,
to give
thank
him
you.
credit.
Thank
Okay,
you.
here's one that I recall you dealing with on some level in the book. Somebody says, do people with a split corpus callosum have two souls after the split?
Well, no, they don't. And here's the first I'll tell you the reasons why I don't think they do. And then I'll tell you how to explain split brain phenomena. First of all, the soul is simple. It's not spatially extended and it's not composed of parts. That means that it is, in principle, indivisible. You never run it up against someone who's 80% of a person. Persons don't come in percentages, and they are not capable of being divided. So, having a personal soul is an all or nothing kind of thing. You either have one or you don't. You can't have 75% of one. In the cases of Dandy Walker syndrome, you can go online and get a picture of their brain. They have 10% of a brain, and that's a little sheath of tissue that coats the inside of the skull, and the entire 90% of what's inside the skull is fluid. It's a sack of fluid. But they function 75 to 80% as well as normal people. They get married, they have jobs, and so on, and they're whole people. They're not 10% people. So the other problem I have with split brain phenomena is that people exhibit what the two streams of consciousness behavior, quote unquote, only under very tight experimental conditions. So they split the corpus callosum, and they will take and they'll put between the eyes, they'll put a little cardboard or a wall where the left eye can't see what's on the right side and the right can't on the left. And then they will put different things where the left eye can see and the right eye can see, but the other eye can't. And under those conditions, you get behavior that looks conflicting. But once they take the apparatus away, the people go home without their corpus callosum being reunited. They go home until they have to come back to the hospital 2 weeks later. They live a normal life. They are unified individuals. And if two souls are created, how is lifting the cardboard that's outside of your head and sitting on the table, you just pick it up and toss it away, how does that make the two souls become one again? It's ridiculous. So split brain phenomena simply shows that the soul is capable, if the organ of the brain is not intact the way it ought to be, it is capable of exhibiting problematic behavior that is not exhibited when the brain is unified the way it should be. And a good solution to this is by the atheist philosopher of mind, Tim Bain, who is probably the world's leading expert on this issue. He's a UK philosopher of neuroscience, and he does not believe that there is any split in the unity of consciousness or anything like that. He explains this behavior by saying that we have what's called a rapid switch, because we rapidly switch from employing the left hemisphere, then the right, then the left, then the right, then the left, and the right. And it's like if you were able to see two things rapidly coming about that were really unified, you might end up seeing them as distinct. And so what happens is then, for Bain says, the rapid fluctuation between using only the left and then only the right and only left and only the right hemisphere means that there is a sense experience of only one thing, and then there's a sense experience of another thing, and those get switched back and forth so rapidly that you begin to have an appearance of opposite thing, and you begin to respond as though there are opposite things that you're responding to. And this exhibits kind of like there's a split in consciousness, but there really isn't. There's just a way of appropriating consciousness from one standpoint, then another standpoint, and then another, and then another. And you end up thinking there are two standpoints, but there really aren't.
That's interesting that an atheist philosopher of his credentials would come to that conclusion. That's significant. Let's take one live. This is from someone who describes himself as an atheist. So I'm curious your thoughts on this one, JP. I don't even know if I'm going to say it right. I apologize in advance. Paleoism says, if animals have souls, can they sin? Why does he think homosexuality is a sin? Now, let's leave the issue of homosexuality to the side. and just address the first one. If
Right.
animals have souls, JP, like you said, can they sin or
Right.
not?
It all depends upon the kind of soul you have. And animals, and this is in Richard Swinburne's book, The Evolution of the Soul. He has 3 chapters on animal souls.
Hmm.
How you know the kind of soul an animal has. It's a scholarly book with a Clarendon Press, a subsidy of Oxford. It's a highly regarded book, and he was a professor at Oxford. So this isn't some uh, just made up thing. There's no evidence that an animal soul is capable of moral action because there's no evidence that animals have the power to grasp universal generalizations. So an animal could grasp, usually crocodiles are dangerous, and that would get them away to safety. But they don't need to grasp all crocodiles are dangerous because that is not as simple. Talk about Occam's razor. You can explain animal behavior that's crocodile avoidant by saying that they grasp most crocodiles are dangerous. It violates Occam's razor to say they grasp all are dangerous. But in order for an act to be a moral act, a real moral act, you have to be
Mm-hmm.
able to universalize it and say that not only is this an obligation for me, but it's an obligation for everyone else that would be in this particular moral situation. Uh, and so they're universalizable. So animals can't universalize, and animals also, there's no evidence that they have libertarian free will.
Mm.
Their actions are determined. So what an animal can experience is a conflict of desire, but it cannot experience a conflict of desire and duty
Mm.
because it has no concept of ought or duty. And when an animal exhibits shame behavior, it doesn't, it's not experiencing moral shame. It has no concept of that. What it's doing is it's cowing down to the alpha male in the herd, and it's exhibiting uh, subservient behavior, or a kind of you're the master, I'm down here, and please don't hurt me or whip me with a newspaper or whatever it might be.
Okay.
So there's no reason to believe that animal souls are capable of moral action, and thus there's no sense in which they could possibly sin.
Mm.
They have no, their soul is not structured that well.
I think it's important to make the distinction that when you talk about a soul, we tend to associate that with a human soul, with, say, creativity, with a mind, with
Right,
will, with a moral conscience. But you're saying animals have souls, but not necessarily the kind of soul that human beings have. So
right,
therefore, they couldn't sin because there's no evidence that that's how animals
right.
even see the world.
Well,
That
another
distinction's
example, absolutely, that's a perfect distinction. And another example would be that if a frog has a soul, but I don't think there's any reason to believe that they have the power of reason or mind. What they have is the power of sensation. They can sense pain and pleasure. They can sense an object of they want to eat flying in front of them, and they'll dart their tongue out. So their soul is very simple. It has sensation powers to sense and experience, but probably not powers of reasoning. That would be
mm.
an example of a different kind of soul suitable for that type of animal.
This next question kind of moves into what's been called panpsychism. And maybe if
Yes.
it's helpful, give people a little bit of a definition or understanding of this. But the person said, could matter have consciousness? And then they said, quantum behavior appears as though matter is connected to consciousness.
Well, you distinguish matter having consciousness with matter being quote unquote connected to consciousness.
Mm.
Now, we've known that matter is connected to consciousness ever since there
Mm.
were primitive human beings. Because, I mean, if I want to explain why there's pottery in this archaeological dig, it's because of the minds of the makers of that pottery brought about certain actions on certain materials that shaped the pot. So that the first cause of that pot coming to be would be the desire, the idea of what it would be, and the desire to bring it about, and the willing to begin that process. So there is a quote connection. Now, if you mean an act of observing can collapse the wave function and cause, let's say, some particular particle in the quantum space to be localized somewhere, that would be an example of how the wave function and its collapsing would depend upon the causal action of an external agent. Because I'm certainly not a constituent of the quantum wave function, am I? I'm not a part of it. It's certainly not a part of me, the one that collapses. I'm an external agent. But now when matter, if you're talking about matter becoming conscious, you're talking about it having an intrinsic nature that is conscious, not being able to act on another external agent. And I don't believe matter is the kind of thing that could possibly become conscious. And I think that panpsychism is a desire to try to allow for real mentality while avoiding the need to postulate a God to cause the first conscious soulish beings. Because on this view, the universe itself is conscious. But you see, the problem with all of this, Sean, is that the connection between a conscious state and a brain state or a physical state in any object like an electron is contingent. It didn't have to be that way. And so an electron, you can easily conceive of possible worlds where an electron has no consciousness. And you could conceive of a possible world where an electron has consciousness. Now, if those are coherent possible worlds, what that means is that even if in our world, an electron has consciousness, it didn't have to have it, because it was equally could have possibly been that they exist without consciousness. So if they all have consciousness, it's contingent. But that raises a big, nasty problem. You don't want your brute facts to be contingent, because that raises the question, why were they this way instead of another way? You want your brute facts to be a necessary being, like the God of Western theism, because you can't ask, well, who created God, or why is God like he is? Because that he is that way of necessity. Yeah, it's a mistake to ask the question. I also think that panpsychism suffers from what's called the combination problem, and David Chalmers, who's a leading panpsychist, admits that there's never been a solution to this problem. And that's how you can take multiples of little tiny conscious things and put them together and get a unified conscious being with his own totalizing conscious experience of the world. You would have little bits of consciousness coming together, and they would maybe all act singing the national anthem together, but there wouldn't be something over and above each little conscious thing that would itself be singing the national anthem. So you can't get a unified whole by just adding little bits together. All you get's an aggregate of bits.
I thought it's helpful that you talked about how kind of somewhat of the comeback or attention on panpsychism is a recognition of the failure of naturalism to account for certain experiences and intuitions and knowledge we have about the world without moving to substance dualism, but it brings other problems which you cited as well.
Excellent point.
So here is a more of a theological question, but some people have, and I think it'd be really helpful for you to flesh this out. We have maybe time for a couple more. This is from BMS Bible Studies. It said, does JP think we are body and soul, or does he think we are body and soul and spirit?
Well, I think I'm a soul. I am a soul. I have a body. A body is deeply, intimately interacting with me. So I'm not a body and soul, because I couldn't die and it wouldn't be me any longer, because I need to have body and soul for it to be me. So a disembodied soul would no longer be me. It would be something else. So I'm a soul, but I do have a body. and I am intimately, but I can exist without that body.
Mm-hmm.
Now, inside of a chest of drawers are several drawers. There's a sock drawer, a t-shirt drawer, an underwear drawer, a sweater drawer. And each of those drawers has a whole bunch of different things in it, but they're all alike in that they're socks. Maybe there's red and winter socks and different kinds of t-shirts, but they're all t-shirts. Now the soul has different faculties. We'll just call them compartments. And there's the faculty of mind, and that contains all the different powers I have to reason, to think, to have beliefs, and my faculty of visual perception is the chest of drawers that has my ability to see orange, to see red, to see yellow, and so on. Now, I believe that the spirit is a faculty of the soul like the mind is. So the spirit is not the chest of drawers. It's only one drawer in the human chest of drawers. Other chest of drawers or organisms don't have spirits as a faculty. But we have a faculty that is a mode, or you might say a compartment of the soul that has our powers to be directly aware of the presence of God, of angels and demons, which don't laugh at that. I know a lot of people who've seen and have interacted with demons and angels, as have I myself. But the Spirit gives us those powers, and so I do believe that their body, soul, and spirit are all real about us. But I would say I'm a soul. I have a body, and I also have, as a set of faculty within me, a faculty of spirit.
Very helpful. Now we're getting to the point. You just have to give us a quick answer on this because I want to respect your time if this is possible. But a few people said, if a human being is body and soul, how do we determine death? Can there be brain activity when somebody is deceased and not really in their body, so to speak?
There can be no brain activity when someone's deceased, and people in comas do have brain activity. So that was a mistaken part of the question. If you believe that the soul, if you're a Cartesian dualist, you're going to use a brain criterion. So when the higher part of the brain is no longer functioning, the soul's gone. If you're an Aristotelian or Thomistic dualist, you're going to use a living criterion. And if there's evidence that the organism is dead and it's not functioning as a unity, at least in some of its systems, then death has occurred.
That was a pretty quick answer. I wasn't sure that I knew you had that in you, JP. Good
I
job,
am not
man.
sure I did either. Thank you, my dear brother.
Got to use every chance I have to just get a little fun.
I love it. I love it.
By the way, I just want to let folks know before we wrap up, your publisher would not send me this, and I'm not upset at you, but it's an expensive book. And I mention this because I read when you sent me like the PDF. I thought, this is so valuable. I want a physical copy myself to go through. So, and it's not a cheap book. It's readable, but it's an academic book. It's one you got to commit to and work through, and it will stretch your mind. But want to have this on so people know about the book, The Substance of Consciousness. JP and I both teach at Talbot School of Theology, Biola University. You can go get a master's degree in philosophy, which I did, JP, and my wife says it turned my life upside down. It transformed me during the 3 years I studied under you and Bill Craig and Scott Ray and Guy Evatt, et cetera, at that time. You can also come study in the apologetics program, and sometimes we have JP teach classes in our apologetics program as well. It's the top-rated apologetics program of its kind, fully distance. And we would love to come behind you to train you to just defend your faith, teach in the church, become an apologist. Information is below. If you're not quite ready to do a master's program, we have a certificate program that you have contributed to, JP, and there's a significant discount below. We'd love to just help you learn more about apologetics. Before you turn off and leave, make sure you hit subscribe. We've got some other shows coming up, including an interview with a former radical Muslim. He was training to do jihad and now is a follower of Jesus. This story blew me away, JP. I usually go about an hour. We went an hour and a half, and by the end, there was a mic drop moment. That's a ways away. Going to post that. but we have a lot of apologetics worldview shows coming up. Make sure you hit subscribe. JP, always fun. Even though you wore that hat to troll me as a Chargers fan, I still love you. We'll have you back soon, brother. Thanks for coming on.
My pleasure, brother.